All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. It is my honor to introduce to Larry Summers. Larry is no stranger to, I think, everybody in this audience. He was the Secretary of the Treasury from 1999 through 2001. He was the 27th president of Harvard University. He then was the director of the National Economic Council. And prior to all of that, he was a renowned scholar and deep thinker on many, many issues in economics and continues to be today. And that's why we have him here. He is well known as a deep thinker on all issues that are troubling us in the economy and in public health today. And so, you know, speaking for myself, it feels like today there is enormous amounts of data and news coming our way, and we're bombarded with it, and yet we're all seeking more clarity, and there's sort of less clarity today than I think there ever was. Last, I wanted to say Larry is a great friend of HBS, and every time we've asked him to speak in front of groups like this, he has been there to share his ideas. So we have about 45 minutes today with me asking some questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience and try to broker some Q&A and take your questions. We'll be doing that by looking at the chat and also please using the raised hand features. So I'd like to cover a lot of ground. So starting with the health crisis, moving to economic policy, politics, financial markets, and then a last word on what all of this means for higher education. So I think it makes sense to start with health. And so Larry, you've written over the past month about the trade-off between our response on the public health side and economic policy. And I think you've been quite persuasive in arguing that there's actually less of a trade-off than one might think, and that in fact one needs to fight the virus first. Do you still believe that? And you know, what's the point? What's the point at which one has to open up the economy, you know, and draw the trade-off the other way?
Robin, let me just first say that I'm glad to be here. Glad to be with so many friends, even if I can't see them. From HBS, especially glad to be here with you. And let me say that these events are not a huge surprise. When I was president of the university, I used to say that global health should be a major priority for the university because the two most important things that were going to happen in the 21st century were the rise of the developing world and the fact that it was going to be a century of biology in the same way that the 20th century was a century of physics, and that those two things were going to come together around the global health issues. We did some calculations a few years ago that demonstrated that on a go-forward present value basis, the consequences of future pandemics were in the same range as the consequences of climate change, but the degree of effort going into climate change was an order of magnitude or two greater. I think on the specific question you asked, the people who frame the question in the way you suggest, that somehow we can help the economy by worrying less about health and opening up more aggressively, I think they miss two fundamental things. First, they miss that mostly it's not our policy that's reducing the performance of the economy, it's the disease itself. You can open up the economy all you want, but when they're hiring extra refrigerator trucks to take care of dead bodies and transport them to the morgues, not very many people are going to decide to go out of their houses. Not many people are going to go shopping when they think 10% of their neighbors have a potentially fatal contagious disease. So blaming the economic collapse on the policy rather than on the problem is fallacious in the same way that observing that wherever you see a lot of oncologists, you'll tend to see a lot of people dying of cancer and inferring that that means that oncologists kill people. It's just a fallacy. Second thing that's fallacious is, yeah, we can create a near-term bit of economic growth by letting it all go. But if that leads us back to the widespread spread of contagious disease, ultimately we're going to be behind. I had the bad luck to rupture both my quad tendons a year ago. I was really eager to get back to playing tennis, to get back to doing things I liked. I was pounding on my physicians to let me take the brace off. And they said, look, you can take the brace off and you might enjoy the next day, but you're really going to hate it when you re-injure the tendons and you're back to zero with weakened tendons and having to go through the whole rehab process again. Well, it's the same logic here. There will come a point when it's right to open up the economy. There might even be some debate about what that point is, but no one who sensibly looks at data could possibly believe that that point is this week or next week. And so that's what I mean when I say right now, the decision would be the same if you were trying to maximize society's welfare or if you were trying to maximize the present value of future GDP. Either way, you have to knock the prevalence of the virus down.
Are you saying that the decision isn't really lockdown or no lockdown? It's really 85% lockdown that we would do anyway versus 99% lockdown that the government suggests?
That's not what I just said, but that I would agree with that. I suspect if we were better at lockdown, we would be able to move out of lockdown faster. Look, some of it's probably cultural about Americans, but when the state of Florida is deciding that professional wrestling is a necessary activity, when people across the country are deciding that that liquor stores and nail salons are essential businesses that need to be kept open, we are just raising the amount of social contact and therefore delaying the moment when we get this under control. So we could be doing this much better.
What do you make, you spent much of your career in the government and particularly the federal government. What do you make of the states leading the COVID response relative to the federal government, at least in the United States?
I think if we had a more competent federal government, there would be more reliance on the federal government and there would be more efficiency because we'd have more coherent and centralized policies on things where there really are gains to scale, like producing ventilators or arranging large-scale testing apparatuses or procuring masks. On the other hand, the more there are differences in attitudes in different places, the more it makes sense to have locally differentiated policies. And in the United States, we've now got radically different views if you look at different parts of the country. So it sort of figures that you're going to have more decentralized solutions. On balance, I think we'd probably be better off if the federal government was more competent and taking more responsibility.
And when we do come out of lockdown, what is that going to be like? How do you think we're going to do it safely? I know, mostly we're going to be talking about economics here, but there are a bunch of different plans.
First of all, I'm not sure we are going to do it safely. Second, even if we do it safely, I think in most things, including my recovery from my ruptured tendons, it's not a steady march from darkness into light. It's not a steady march uphill. It's 3 steps up, 1 or 2 steps down, 3 steps up. So I think we're going to see a series of movements in both directions, and there are going to be moments when we step too far and we have to then lock things down. By the way, if there were no moments when we had to lock things down, it would, in some area, it would probably mean that we weren't moving rapidly enough as we move forward. But I think this is going to be a pretty gradual process. It's going to be more people can go outside and go shopping. It's going to be quite a while before you're going to see a large number of people in a small amount of area. If I had to bet, I'm guessing, I don't remember, that the big conference room that HBS uses a lot in Spangler, I would guess can seat 300 or 400 people for a meal. I would be quite surprised if in calendar 2020, that room at any point had more than 75 people in it.
So let me turn to questions of policy. If you were Treasury Secretary today, what would you be most worried about over the coming months and years?
I think probably I would be, depends on exactly how you ask the question. At one level, what I would be worried about was that the global system was going to be caused to collapse by this, that we were going to mismanage and China was going to mismanage the US-China relationship into a new Cold War and complete backstop or backdrop from globalization, and that was going to have consequences that were going to go far beyond this. At a second level, I'd be worried that a country that can do extraordinary things was somehow going to suffer substantially economically, was going to lose a substantial number of lives, and was going to seem slightly pathetic to the world because it was unable to produce enough swabs, unable to produce enough masks, and unwilling to invest with sufficient money and with sufficient coherence and force from the government to be able to perform the very simple task of getting a large number of people tested for a deadly disease. So at a different level, I'd be worried about that. And then within my remit, I would be worried that we didn't have clear enough thinking and adequate enough systems to make money flow to people who needed it and not flow to people who did not need it. I would find the spectacle of hedge funds being eligible for the PPP pretty disturbing. I would find the spectacle of Harvard professors with small consulting businesses who had a couple of employees being able to get 2 months payroll for those employees from the taxpayers as a grant to be pretty appalling. I would find the idea that the Boeing Corporation was going to get tens of billions of dollars that was not going to come at the expense of shareholders after everything that had happened to be pretty disturbing. And at the same time, I'd be looking at the poor guy who ran a pizza shop in a disadvantaged neighborhood who couldn't quite fight his way through the system at JP Morgan to get his $32,000 to keep the 3 people who worked for him going. I would find that pretty disturbing.
So this is a great set of questions around business failure and, the inevitable business failure that we're going to have coming. And, you reference a small business. Large business, we have Chapter 11 system that works reasonably well. I guess there's two things I'd like to know. One is, are you confident that the Chapter 11 system would be a good one for dealing with large companies? And in terms of the smaller businesses, your example of Larry's Pizza with 3 employees, what's the right way to handle that business versus the larger businesses in the economy?
I think in general, there has been an excessive view in some quarters that we should be trying to save every business and every job. In the typical month in the American economy, about 4 million people leave a job. So in a typical year, a third of the jobs in the country are left. You look in a variety of industries, there's very, very high turnover of firms. So even in the best of times, it's not that all the existing establishments are frozen in place. I think there are mechanisms that allow these things to be worked through. Yes, somebody may be able to not be able to pay their rent, but in the current environment, what's the landlord going to do? He could maybe he or she can evict them, but if they do, how are they ever going to get another tenant in there? And so riding along with this tenant's probably the best strategy. So I think we need to put a lot of money in to stimulate purchasing power. I think we need to put a lot of money in to protect every worker's possessing a reasonable income. I think we've got to put a lot of money into state and local governments on whom poor people depend for their basic standard of living. But I don't think we need to put grant money that's not coming back to the government into large numbers of companies on a very large scale. Yes, there should be some of that money going into the pizza shops, but I think when we're doing business with substantial companies, the government should be a preferred creditor where possible, should have preferred interests where possible, or security, and the government should be taking warrants in those companies so that in the places where it succeeds, which I suspect will be a fair number, taxpayers are better off. If you take the TARP in aggregate, the bank bailouts, the automobile bailouts, all of it, the government on average made money on all of that. And so I think that's what we should be trying to do. Things may end up tougher. We may not exactly make money, but I think these ideas around large scale transfers to business are very problematic.
So this principle of the government needs to make money out of it, it's true that in 2007 and 2008, the programs that were enacted, overall, the government made money on those programs. Are you extending that to the pizza shops, or is that we should be willing to lose some money?
I think we should be willing to lose some money for the smallest businesses, but we need to be kind of careful as we go about losing money. I think it would be I obviously would never make the claim, but a government program where I'd be able to make a claim for my research assistants doesn't seem to me to be a well-designed government program.
Sounds like you basically want capitalism to do what capitalism does, and then to help the most vulnerable in our society, whether those be the smallest business owners or employees, and so on. So
that's generally right. I think that's the generally right economic philosophy, and I think we make a mistake when we say it's really important, therefore we're going to forget about market principles. I think we should be trying to pay very generously for swabs and for masks and for tests, and one of the many things that's causing that to be difficult is there's a sense that if you invest in advance to have an inventory of those things in a moment like this, people are going to say, well, thank you very much for having done that, and we'll be happy to take it from you at marginal cost. So I think we need to think very carefully about the incentives we create for people who want to prepare for a disaster that might happen and might not happen.
Yeah, that's something that we should be willing to lose money on. Expected returns on holding stockpiles should be low or negative. Turning to the Fed, what do you make of the Fed's response to what's happened? And particularly, I think the audience here would be interested in understanding parallels to 2008 and whether those parallels have been stretched. What's your overall assessment of what the Fed has done?
Well, first of all, just in terms of walls of money or towers of money, compared to history, what we've done this year has been the Himalayas. What we did in 2008 was the Rockies, and everything else was, the foothills of Vermont. So we are getting to more and more unprecedented territory. And I would have done things very, very much like what the Fed did. But I think when we're declaring whatever it takes in terms of central bank activity once a decade, which seems to be the new normal here after Mario Draghi and now what we're going through now, I think there's going to need to be a lot of soul searching and thinking about the way our financial system is functioning. In the midst of all this, I don't think there's really a viable alternative, but I do wonder about a world where the Federal Reserve is buying exchange traded funds whose only asset is high yield bonds, represented by companies who are on all sides of those various transactions. So I think we're going to have a lot of soul searching afterwards about what our principles exactly are, because many of the principles we thought we had before, we have crossed. I mean, many people, there's a heated argument about the decision as to whether the Fed could or could not have bailed out Lehman legally, and whether whatever was legal, whether it would or would not have been appropriate to bail out Lehman. We are far, far beyond, in terms of the breadth of the Fed's intervention in the economy, where we were with respect to Lehman. Or to put it another way, in terms of government deficits, we are closer to the post-Pearl Harbor period than to the post-Lehman period, in terms of the amount by which and the speed with which the government is ratcheting up spending. I do think there should be some change of focus back to the health issue. The truth is that if I'm scared because I think I might die if I go to the store or go to my job, you can do whatever you want with the interest rate and you can do whatever you want with the government budget deficit, but the economy is not going to be very good. And I think if we're able to get people's confidence back around the health, the recovery can be somewhat more rapid than people suppose. People often suggest, well, recoveries are always slow. Well, not all recoveries everywhere are so slow. I'm talking here from Truro, Massachusetts. Truro, Massachusetts has a depression from October to May of every year. And then there's massive economic growth from May to June and June to July. And, then it's back to the depression.
But Truro, Massachusetts plans for that.
Yeah, sure. So it's going to be easier, but a lot of the people who are closed now can be planning to reopen at some point. So yes, we have to have a lot of liquidity. I'm not disputing that. I mean, the point I'm making is that if we put the health problems credibly behind us, and people believe we're going to be able to put the health problems credibly behind us, then we will be able to engage in exactly that kind of planning. And then I think our recovery could be more rapid than it was. But I'm not sure any of that's going to happen because I'm not sure how clearly we're doing the requisite kind of planning.
Is there going to be inflation this time? So with the Fed balance sheet growing at a rate that is higher than in the financial crisis, and there was lots of discussion about whether the Fed was overreaching and there was going to be inflation that turned out not to be. Is this time different?
I thought in 2009 and 2010, the people who were excited that this was going to produce really high inflation, many of whom I have to say were graduates of your school, had not done a good job studying their courses. That if they had done a reasonable job studying monetary economics, they would have understood that when money pays interest, there isn't the same urge to disgorge it quickly, and so a large Fed balance sheet, there's no particular reason why it needs to be inflationary, and B, that the Federal Reserve had tools in terms of the ability to manage interest rates that would enable it to contain any incipient inflation. And so I thought the people who were warning then were basically foolish. And history has borne out that view in the sense that none of the major central banks can basically get to their 2% inflation targets. I think it's more complicated this time because this time there's a substantial element of supply shock. The fact that a third of the people in the economy can't go to work means that the potential production of the economy is much lower, and we're doing a great deal to boost demand with all these tax cuts and all these various lending and stimulating programs. So I would guess that we're headed into a continuing deflationary, or not deflationary, but disinflationary period around the world. I was warning a year ago about Japanification and black hole monetary economics of zero interest rates. And it seems to me this has done more to reinforce that than it does to operate in the other direction. But I certainly think the risks of accelerating inflation or high inflation are higher than they were than I thought they were 3 months ago.
Sorry, and
we're in a very funny world that we don't really, at least I don't feel like I have experience with. I mean, one of the things people say is when we get such large national debts, there's an inevitable tendency to want to inflate them away. Well, the Bank of Japan has been trying to get the inflation rate up even just a little bit for a decade now, and they haven't been able to do it. So that makes these easily uttered sentences about inflating away debt and the like at least carry more uncertainty with them.
So on your earlier comment that overall this tends to push the other direction, did you have in mind there that the level of precautionary saving in the economy is going to go up, and that's going to put further negative pressure on the real rate? What exactly did you have in mind?
I had in mind two and a half things. I think that there's going to be more uncertainty, which is going to operate to raise saving. I think there's going to be more opportunity, more savings propensity. I think there's going to be more uncertainty, and that's going to operate to reduce investment. And those two things together are going to reinforce the various secular stagnation arguments that I've been making for a number of years. So I think we're going to see less investment and more liquidity flowing into existing assets, which means more bubble risks and the like. You know, the very high levels of share repurchases you were seeing just prior to this pandemic, almost all of which were financed by leverage, are an illustration of exactly that principle. I also think that I think it basically comes down centrally to the increased uncertainty and the tendency to that meaning lower saving and lower investment. I would kind of guess that this is also on net going to reinforce the demassification of the economy. You're going to see more Zoom conferences and fewer conferences in hotels. You're going to see more e-commerce and less retail commerce. Those tendencies are going to operate in the direction of reducing the neutral real interest rate. So I think we're headed into a world of negative neutral real interest rates, considerable difficulty for central banks in raising inflation rates. And so I think it's going to be a macroeconomically complicated world where most of the action is going to be in things that are blurring together fiscal and monetary policy. When the Fed buys junk bonds, that's blurring together fiscal and monetary policy because you can think of that as buying a safe bond plus giving a substantial credit subsidy. When the Treasury issues 10-year notes and the Fed buys them, that's another kind of blurring together of fiscal and monetary policy. So I think we're going to be living in a world of much more hybrid policies than has been traditional.
So just to clarify for the audience here, the logic about suppose we all decide to start working from home, the idea is just that it's going to be a less capital intensive society. We don't need the office buildings and the parking lots. And so on net
spaces and the office computers that are separate from the home computers. I mean, these things have been in train for a substantial period of time. You know, a large bank that I work with now has 3/4 as many offices for its relatively high-level people as it did before, because it's got a set of technology where you can walk into an office and you can hit a button and type in a code, and then all of a sudden pictures of your wife and your children appear on the electronic frames, and the computer comes up and says, welcome, Mr. Summers, and gives you access to all your files. And if somebody walks into that office 5 minutes later, it looks like it's yours. And in the presence of that technology, they don't need to occupy nearly as much space as they did before. Well, the world of Zoom is going to be a world that's going to take that one step further.
What is your view of what's happening at the local level and the local governments? Many of them are not collecting tax revenues to the extent that they were before, and many local and state governments were already in pretty rough shape. All this being reflected in the current muni markets and the pricing of muni debt. Where do you think this is headed?
Where it should be headed is the federal government should be making substantial resources available to them, whether as grants or whether as extra support for their Medicaid programs, or by allowing the some reduction of the balanced budget amendments that many of them live with. I mean, you can debate the idea that, and you can make good arguments on both sides, that at a downturn moment like this is a good or a bad idea to start making additional investments in infrastructure. I tend to think it is, but that's something that reasonable people can certainly debate. But it's hard to believe that this is a good moment to stop maintaining the highways and eliminating potholes as more and more people are out of work. It's hard to believe that this is a good moment when municipal hospitals should be tightening their budgets. That's just hard to believe. And we just need to figure out how to be countercyclical in what happens at the state and local government. Or even, it'd be good enough if we just figured out to not be pro-cyclical in terms of what happens to state and local governments. And this would also be a moment, since the federal government's providing money, some influence comes with that to improve practices in a variety of areas in the state and local sector. But I think it's just tragic to see these jurisdictions being forced to cut their budgets at the very moment when their revenues are least and their needs are greatest. And it seems to me it would be the beginnings of a rational society to find ways of avoiding that.
Let me turn to the financial markets. So it's been a puzzling month for many of us following the markets. I want to start with the equity markets and then maybe talk a little bit about other markets, in particular energy. But if you have a simple present value model, such as we do in a HBS classroom with a real discount rate of 8% and a real growth rate of 3%, that gives you a multiple of 20. And so the first year is roughly 5% of total value. And of course, the first year could be negative, and so maybe it's 10% if it's the same as last year, but with the opposite sign. But markets were down nearly 40%. Then now they're back up to a cumulative drawdown of about 15%. What do you make of what's happening in the stock market overall?
Look, Jack Meyer used to run the Harvard Endowment, and he was very successful in running the Harvard Endowment. And one of the secrets of his success was he never invested on the basis of anything that anybody in the economics department said. So do not take anything I'm saying as investment advice. I think the general experience, pretty universal experience, is that serious recessions come with serious market downturns. And 15% is not a serious market downturn. I think the general experience is that serious recessions come with market downturns that include many false dawns. There were 5 rallies of more than 25% between October of 1929 and July of 1932, one of which was 93%. There was a 27% rally from a point after Lehman until the beginning of 2009, when the market started to go sharply down again. So point 1, serious recessions come with serious downturns. Point 2, there are a lot of false dawns. Point 3, for reasons that economists can debate, I wrote a number of papers at one stage about so-called hysteresis theories. The evidence is pretty strong that when there's a recession, we don't ever quite get back to the previous trend line. We might grow as fast as we did before the recession, but we never get back anywhere near the previous trend line. So, if you look today, not today, if you look if you looked at the end of 2019 at where was US GDP relative to the trend line that somebody would have plotted before the 2008 financial crisis, the answer is it was way below. 12% below, 15%.
Yeah, that's a stunning picture, but the
and
corporate profits.
You'd find something similar for many different, if you looked at many different recessions, that in general, you ended up below the trend line. So when I see the most serious recession we've had since the Second World War, I kind of think it's more likely than not that we'll have a pretty substantial, at least modestly sustained market decline. And so from that perspective, I've been surprised by the bounce from the bottom. And I also tend to think that it's a broad lesson of financial history that the Fed and the power of liquidity and all of that can matter for a while, but it can't matter forever. And so given those circumstances, I would be skeptical about either inferring as an investor that we'd seen the worst and all was well, or as a economic forecaster, assuming that an omniscient market has made a judgment on the basis of which one can be optimistic. But look, there are many different possibilities, and even more than would usually be true. I think that diversification and recognition of uncertainty is appropriate.
You mentioned the different scenarios and the weights that the market must be placing on them. What is your maybe not the 99th percentile left tail scenario, but the 95th percentile or 90th percentile left tail scenario? What happens to the economy in that scenario?
Some combination of three things. One, the health stuff ends up being much worse than we thought. Some combination of, we still haven't found an AIDS vaccine, so we don't have a vaccine 18 months from now. It turns out that just because you've had the virus doesn't mean you're immune from the virus going forward. And if you're a virus survivor, there's substantial continuing morbidity that affects your life expectancy for quite some time to come. So people are petrified of the thing. And whatever policy is about going out, people don't basically want to be near other people or in commerce, number one. Number two, there is cascading financial failure, because in addition to the things on which people are now focused, there is a problem. Roughly no major retailer has paid rent in the last month or two. And I heard a story about one of the most prestigious Wall Street institutions I know isn't paying its rent in some cities, not because it can't, but because it won't. And so in a world where nobody pays rent, probably people aren't going to pay mortgages for very long. And there's all kinds of financial carnage behind that. And by the way, when people aren't paying rent, not far behind, they're not going to be paying credit cards, and they're not going to be paying car loans, and they're going to say, come take my machine tools if you want. And so if you run into substantial non-payment problems that cascade, you're looking at very substantial financial distress. And we have taken a remarkably domestic view of this crisis so far. And there is vast potential trouble in the non-China emerging market sector. And for every bit of boldness there's been in the domestic response, there has so far been timidity in the global response. And there are very large financial exposures all over to emerging markets. So I'd say the second level of the second part of the apocalypse triangle is pervasive financial problems. And the third is great uncertainty and highly toxic politics as people process that this is going to be with them for a long time and lose confidence in the institutions that failed to offer protection and become more responsive to potential leaders on horseback. And so if you take those three possibilities together, you can manufacture a really very dark perspective. Now, I want to be very clear. That is not my best guess as to what's going to happen. I think that the history of the United States is more a history that demonstrates the power of self-denying prophecy, that people are able to identify potential problems, and because they're able to identify potential problems, responses get put in place and disasters get avoided. But one can certainly lay out a scenario, and I think it's a much easier to lay out a disastrous scenario from here than it would have been to have done that exercise. And somebody who tried to do it was very alarmed by it in December of 2008.
So sticking in this very dark tale for just a minute, I want to ask you a question. This is a question that's courtesy of our friend Andre, which is, you were talking about the dark spot that politics could land in. What do you think Trump could do, or what political response are you worried about if Trump looks like he's going to lose?
Oh, look, I think it is cautionary to read the history of Hungary of the last 6 or 7 years. It is cautionary to read the history of almost all of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1920s, or many other parts of Europe in the 1920s. There is not. It is probably the wrongest. The questions about its interpretation, but probably the wrongest famous phrase of the last 35 years was the phrase "the end of history." The idea that liberal democracy is somehow an absorbing state where when you get to it, you don't leave it, is not actually a judgment that is historically supported. I was very much involved in the effort in the early 90s to do for Russia at the end of the Cold War what was done for Japan and Germany at the end of the Second World War. If you had told all of us who were involved in that effort how much of an enemy of the United States and how much of a totalitarian state Russia would be a quarter century later, we would have found that, I'm not sure we would have said it was a laughable proposition, but we would have found it to be really a quite implausible proposition. So I can't lay out the precise scenario for what it is that might happen, but it seems to me that any study that's thoughtful of history makes us, there's one lesson that comes from it. It is never say never, because things come back. I mean, in a much less consequential sphere. When I was in graduate school in the late 70s, I studied the liquidity trap, but I thought it was a sort of interesting historical curiosity about how we had zero interest rates in the 1930s. I didn't think that was some event that was going to come back. My students today feel that way about double-digit inflation. I don't think it's coming back anytime soon, but I think eventually most of the themes get replayed. So I think there's very substantial grounds for concern. Ultimately, do I think that our institutions in the United States are relatively resilient? Yes, I do. And I've got reasonable amount of confidence in it, but it's precisely what I referred to before, Robin, the capacity for self-denying prophecy that gives me that confidence. And the moment we lose that capacity for prophecy and become complacent, I think is the moment that complacency will prove to be a self-denying prophecy.
Last question for me, and then I want to turn it over to the audience. What are the implications of this health crisis on higher education, and particularly on Harvard?
Look, it's not going to be good. It's very expensive. It's very expensive because of all the things that one needs to do to deal with it in the moment as you become a non-residential university. It's very consequential for universities that, like Harvard, are dependent on philanthropy. As people become less wealthy, they become less certain about their futures, and they have a widened universe of possible places for their philanthropy. It's very expensive. I mean, take HBS, whose finances are non-trivially dependent on an executive education market that is surely going to be affected very fundamentally by this. And so, and to the extent that universities have been the cutting edge of globalization, a world where travel becomes much harder is going to change the global character of universities. I think the question is whether universities are going to respond in the ways that good businesses respond to tough times, or in the ways that bad businesses respond to tough times. The defining feature of bad businesses is across the board. We freeze everybody, we freeze salaries, we say that each unit has to take an X% cut. We look for the types of spending that are most visible and discretionary and cut them off. And so it's kind of a strategic removal of the butter from every piece of the bread. That's what bad businesses do. What good businesses do is they do a little bit of that, because you have to show that you're serious. And then you do two other things. You think about the things that were right to do all along that you would have done if you'd had the courage to do them, but are really uncomfortable. And you do them using the excuse of the crisis. So you come out with leaner and more effective and of higher average quality. That's one thing you do. Second thing you do, there actually be three things. The second thing you do is if you're a leader, you recognize that your strength is going to be much more relative strength in a crisis than it was going to be. And so there are going to be opportunities to acquire entities or opportunities to acquire people or opportunities to move into spheres that others are unable to. So you see it as a strategic opportunity to go for the long run. And the third thing you do is you figure some aspect of the situation that would enable you to play offense as well as defense. And Harvard is one of the five great, I don't know what the other four are, but Harvard is one of the five great brands of the world. And we now have Zoom education or distance education handled remotely has now gotten a 20-year shot in the arm. And we've got the best brand in the world and the most liquidity in the world. And that is a market of potentially staggering scale. And the question's going to be, are we going to take advantage of it? Or are we going to kind of doodle along in the way we have, gradually expanding? And the question is whether we're going to find the courage to see this as a staggering opportunity, both to influence not 10,000 students on our campus, but 10 million students around the world. And if we're successful in doing that, there's vast potential to improve the economics of everything else we do. So I hope we find our way to the requisite boldness. But look, it's easy to sort of prescribe from the outside, and it's much harder to do it from the inside. And I think the university is very, very fortunate in the leadership that it has.
I mean, I've been reminded many times by friends of mine that if you look at some of the most successful private organizations in our economy, like the McKinseys and Goldman Sachs, they have a headcount that's somewhere between 10 and 100 times greater than it was 30 years ago. And then you look at organizations like Harvard, and they have grown at, pretty snail's pace, and even more so by comparison. So let me turn it to a question. So the first question, let me just summarize something that I've seen in the chat. And then for the next set of questions, if you'd like to just use the hand raise feature on the attendees, we can call on you. But actually, why don't we start with one of those? So Sunny Huang, what's your question? I'm going to allow you to talk. Sunny? Okay, we're ready for you to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So I find it so incredible that, Larry, not only are you incredibly successful yourself and incredibly influential, but you've also mentored, the influential Sheryl Sandberg and continued your influence and impact there. So I was wondering, in your experience, what kind of major qualities, experiences, personality traits do you see in the kind of people like yourself, like Sheryl Sandberg, who then go on to leave such an incredible impact in the world?
Thank you for asking that. I'm proud to have mentored Sheryl when she was young, and there are a variety of other people I've had a chance to work with. I don't want to start singling people out who I'm proud to have mentored. I guess the most successful people, in my experience, are people who here are some traits they have. They're never satisfied. They always want to hear how something can be done better, no matter how well they just did it. They never miss an opportunity to try to make a contribution. It's part of their DNA. They understand from a very early stage in their careers that if somebody's mentoring them, they should be mentoring somebody. And so they're very invested in the success of all the people who are around them. They are loyal to people who are loyal to them, even if it's not easy to do. And I would say being really good at reciprocating loyalty, being invested in all the people that who are around you, never being off, and always wanting to make things better, and always wanting to grow and learn, and never feel that there's anything that can't be improved. I would say of the people who I've mentored and have been most successful, I think those are fairly common attributes.
All right, next question. Daniel Ovalar, I'm going to allow you to ask your question here.
Thanks, Larry. So we've seen how the Fed has been supporting the various asset classes, including investment grade, high yield, and others, to avoid the decline. So if that's the case, how do you correct the fundamental disconnect that exists between the economy and the racing stock market?
First of all, never be so confident that you know what the fundamentals are. Alan Greenspan was really a pretty smart guy, very, very smart guy, who had 50 years of experience forecasting the economy, was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, had hundreds of PhD economists at his disposal, and was really a very shrewd guy. And he started talking about irrational exuberance in 1996, when the Dow was at 6,300. I think we can now safely say that he was wrong, to think that markets were irrationally exuberant at that point. So first of all, it's just a mistake to think you know what the right fundamentals are with so high a degree of confidence. Second, sometimes these problems work themselves out gradually. Market comes down a bit, the economy comes up a bit. What was once Jaws becomes a guppy's mouth, and the gap just diminishes. Third, sometimes what happens is markets get propped up and then they can't be propped up any longer, and then they fall fast. Those are all possibilities in a situation of this kind. But I think it always is a good idea to approach the world from a perspective of recognizing multiple scenarios. That said, 15% down from a somewhat frothy previous high at a still early stage in the worst recession in 75 years seems like a bit of a surprising configuration to me.
Great. Next question, actually, former student of mine, Dennis Chua. There you go. Dennis, what's your question?
Hey, Robin, thanks for that. Larry, thanks for doing this. I guess it's not crazy if the virus resurges in the fall. When that happens, do you think it's feasible for some states to be complete lockdown while others chase an aggressive herd immunity path? And how do you think that looks like?
I think you're going to see a fair amount of, we've seen more informal barriers to interstate commerce in the last month than I ever would have expected to see in the United States. But I think we'll see many, many more than we do in the current scenario. I'm sort of glad that my house and my vacation house happen to be in the same state, because it sort of makes it easier to move between them. So I think you'll see some tendencies in the direction that you described. You'll see some tendencies towards border closing or limiting movements between borders. I have a suspicion that by the fall, testing of various kinds will become a good deal easier than it is now. And so it will be more possible to check people before they come into your store, before they come into your movie theater, before they get on your airplane, whatever. So I think the configuration may be a bit different than it is right now. I also think that reality has a way of being debate closing. And if you've got sort of Singapore-style epidemics starting to rage in places, I think that we can go for it strategy is going to start looking a little less tenable in those places. And when people decide they're going to dash for herd immunity, but nobody's going to join the race because they don't actually want to be in the store with the other people who are busy getting the virus, I think there's going to be some tendency to go back towards the more traditional strategy. So I think you raise a really important issue, but if I had to guess, for the combination of reasons I articulated, it'll be a bit less salient than the tone of your question suggested.
Andy's going to summarize some questions that have been coming up from international folks in the audience. Andy?
Thanks, Robin. Larry, some great questions from the international domain, and I think we'll have to be a little bit more lightning round on this than ideally. But first, impact on emerging markets lacking the fiscal space to do big stimulus, on the future of globalization, and on U.S.-China relations.
Emerging markets, brutal. Lack of institutional capacity, lack of healthcare, already experienced substantial capital flight, no export markets, in addition to the things that you said. I think it's likely to be extremely difficult for emerging markets. Globalization, look, I always, for 50 years, tended to hear people, when people tended to ramble on about the United States needs to be self-sufficient in X, I always thought it was a big world and there were a lot of countries and it's going to be hard to cut people off. And I tended to think that if you're talking about self-sufficiency, you were probably a special interest trying to get protection for your thing. I now think I was to some degree wrong. And self-sufficiency is going to be a much larger theme in any trade policy discussion than it has been previously. And that has to be bad for globalization. And, I asked myself, how long will Davos survive this? What's Davos? Davos is thousands of people in a very, very congested place for 4 or 5 days, all of whom have flown there to get to the place for the purpose of being closely gathered with each other. Is that institution going to happen 9 months from now? Maybe. If it doesn't happen for a year or two, is this fundamentally implausible thing? The whole of the world's elite goes to a small ski town, going to start up again? I don't know the answer to that. It may well happen, but it's not a certainty that it will happen. And I choose that example because it's a kind of quintessential image of at least a certain sort of globalization. God, you would hope and you would think that if we were facing an invasion from Mars, that would push the United States and China closer together, just as President Reagan discussed with President Gorbachev about the United States and Russia if there was an invasion from Mars. But doesn't look like it so far when we've got an invasion from the microbial world. And I'm very, very worried about what happens between the United States and China.
Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more. You know how much time? Yeah, we have one or two more questions here. Charles Hill, what's your question, Charles? All right, no Charles. I'm going to move over here. Samuele Passi, what's your question?
Hi, Larry. My question regards the European Union. There is a big debate nowadays on mutualization of the effort to recover the economy, and some of the countries like Italy, where I'm from, which have like emerging market, no currency to sustain the economy. What is your view in terms of what is going to happen?
I don't know. I don't think. I think it's probably. It's got to be that this is going to make the survival of the European Union less likely, or of the euro less likely. The degree of heterogeneity among the countries has gone up. The chances for radical politics coming to power has gone up. The enthusiasm for high integration and free mobility of peoples across the borders has gone down. So it can't be good for the European Union concept, it seems to me. But whether that means the risks of a breakup have gone from 2% to 6%, or from 15% to 35%, that's a very difficult judgment to make, which I wouldn't want to try to make with conviction.
Last question here, Andy has gotten from the chat, which is, if you look ahead to the society that we want post-crisis, what would your priorities be?
Look, I hope we learn something from this. I hope we all live lives with a little bit less frenetic travel and a little bit more interaction of the kind we're having now. I hope we learn, many of us, that it's actually really nice to sleep under the same roof with members of our family for multiple weeks in a row. I hope we have, because of the seriousness of this threat, a bit more of an appreciation of our common humanity across different parts of this country and across across different parts of the world. I hope we realize that after what is, let's be honest, a complete failure of public institutions that allowed this to happen, that a market-based theory is insufficient, and that a functioning market economy requires a very strong public sector, and that this will be a kind of death knell to libertarian ideologies and to a fair amount of the Reagan-Thatcher age. And at the same time, I hope that the failures of competence of the public sector will be a wake-up call to many who believe that as long as you feel the right things, you don't really have to have much capacity for analytical rigor, and that politics can be an articulation of feelings. It seems to me that that set of ideas has been discredited as well. So I hope at the end of what has been a really quite angry and fractious period, this will lead to more of a broad appreciation of the need for calm, rational competence at a time when that seems too much in short supply.
For being with us today, I can say with confidence that there are few people in this world who could cover from health to the economy to our relation with China to higher education and to our aspirations for a better future. It was an amazing hour and 15 minutes with you, and thank you for doing it with all of us.
It was very good to be with you, and good luck to everybody. Stay safe.